Chapter 13, Part 2, of the Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The disabled ship had not long been headed for Basse Terre when the faint streaks of dawn announced the approach of the 12th of April, a day doubly celebrated in naval annals. The sun had not quite set upon the exhausted squadrons of Suffren and Hughes, anchoring after their fiercest battle off Ceylon, when his early rays shone upon the opening strife between Rodney and De Grasse. The latter was at the time the greatest naval battle in its results that had been fought in a century. Its influence on the course of events was very great, though far from as decisive as it might have been. It was attended with circumstances of unusual though somewhat factitious brilliancy, and particularly was marked by a manoeuvre that was then looked upon as exceptionally daring and decisive, breaking the line. It must be added that it has given rise to a storm of controversy, and the mass of details, as given by witnesses who should be reliable, are so confused and contradictory, owing mainly to the uncertainties of the wind, that it is impossible now to do more than attempt to reconcile them in a full account. Nevertheless, the leading features can be presented with sufficient accuracy, and this will first be done briefly and barely. The outline thus presented can afterward be clothed with the details which give color, life, and interest to the great scene. At daylight, about half past 5, the English fleet, which had gone about at 2 A.M., was standing on the starboard tack, with the wind at southeast, an unusual amount of southing for that hour. It was then about 15 miles from the Saints, which bore north-northeast, and 10 from the French fleet, which bore northeast. The latter, owing to the events of the night, was greatly scattered, as much as 8 or 10 miles, separating the weather or easternmost ships from the lee, the flag-ship Ville de Paris being among the latter. Anxiety for the "Zélé" kept the French admiral, with the ships in his company, under short canvas, standing to the southward on the port tack. The English on the starboard tack, with the wind as they had it, headed east-northeast, and thus, as soon as there was light to see, found the French broad on the lee bow, and one of M. de Grasse's ships, the "Zélé," towed by a frigate, square under our lee, with his bowsprit and foremast prostrate across his forecastle. To draw the French farther to leeward, Rodney detached 4 ships to chase the "Zélé." As soon as De Grasse saw this, he signalled his fleet to keep away, as Rodney wished, and at the same time to form the line of battle, thus calling down to him the ships to windward. The English line was also formed rapidly, and the chasing ships recalled at 7 A.M. De Grasse, seeing that if he stood on he would lose the weather gage altogether, hauled up again on the port tack, and the breeze changing to east-southeast and east in his favor, and knocking the English off, the race of the two fleets on opposite tacks for the advantage of the wind became nearly equal. The French, however, won, thanks to a superiority in sailing which had enabled them to draw so far to windward of the English on the previous days, and but for the awkwardness of the "Zélé" might have cleared them altogether. Their leading ships first reached and passed the point where the rapidly converging tracks intersected, while the English leader, the Marlborough, struck the French line between the 6th and 10th ships variously stated. The battle, of course, had by this time begun, the 9th ship in the French line, the "Brave," opening fire at 20 minutes before 8 A.M. upon the Marlborough. As there was no previous intention of breaking the line, the English leader kept away, in obedience to a signal from Rodney, and ran close along under the enemy's lee, followed in succession by all the ships as they reached their wake. The battle thus assumed the common and indecisive phase of two fleets passing on opposite tacks, the wind very light, however, and so allowing a more heavy engagement than common under these circumstances, the ships sliding by at the rate of 3 to 4 knots. Since the hostile lines diverged again south of their point of meeting, De Grasse made signal to keep away 4 points to south-southwest, thus bringing his van to action with the English rear, and not permitting the latter to reach his rear unscathed. There were, however, two dangers threatening the French if they continued their course. Its direction, south or south-southwest, carried them into the calms that hung round the north end of Dominica, and the uncertainty of the wind made it possible that by its hauling to the southward the enemy could pass through their line and gain the wind, and with it the possibility of forcing the decisive battle which the French policy had shunned, and this was in fact what happened. De Grasse therefore made signal at 8:30 to wear together and take the same tack as the English. This, however, was impossible; the two fleets were too close together to admit the evolution. He then signaled to haul close to the wind and wear in succession, which also failed to be done, and at 9:05 the dreaded contingency arose. The wind hauled to the southward, knocking off all the French ships that had not yet kept away, that is, all who had English ships close under their lee. Rodney, in the Formidable, was at this time just drawing up with the fourth ship astern of De Grasse's flag. Luffing to the new wind, he passed through the French line, followed by the 5 ships next astern of him, while nearly at the same moment, and from the same causes, his sixth astern led through the interval abreast him, followed by the whole English rear. The French line of battle was thus broken into places by columns of enemy's ships in such close order as to force its vessels aside, even if the wind had not conspired to embarrass their action. Every principle upon which a line of battle was constituted, for mutual support and for the clear field of fire of each ship, was thus overthrown for the French, and preserved for the English divisions which filed through; and the French were forced off to leeward by the interposition of the enemy's columns, besides being broken up. Compelled thus to forsake the line upon which they had been ranged, it was necessary to reform upon another, and unite the three groups into which they were divided, a difficult piece of tactics under any circumstances, but doubly so under the moral impression of disaster, and in presence of a superior enemy, who, though himself disordered, was in better shape, and already felt the glow of victory. It does not appear that any substantial attempt to reform was made by the French. To reunite, yes, but only as a flying disordered mass. The various shifts of wind and movements of the divisions left their fleet at midday with the centre 2 miles northwest of and to leeward of the van, the rear yet farther from the centre and to leeward of it. Calms and short puffs of wind prevailed now through both fleets. At 1:30 P.M. a light breeze from the east sprang up, and De Grasse made signal to form the line again on the port tack. Between 3 and 4, not having succeeded in this, he made signal to form on the starboard tack. The two signals and the general tenor of the accounts show that at no time were the French reformed after their line was broken, and all the manoeuvres tended toward, even if they did not necessitate, taking the whole fleet as far down as the most leewardly of its parts. In such a movement it followed, of course, that the most crippled ships were left behind, and these were picked up one by the English, who pursued without any regular order, for which there was no need, as mutual support was assured without it. Shortly after 6 P.M., De Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris, struck her colors to the Barfleur, carrying the flag of Sir Samuel Hood. The French accounts state that 9 of the enemy's ships then surrounded her, and there is no doubt that she had been fought to the bitter end. Her name, commemorating the great city whose gift she had been to the king, her unusual size, and the fact that no French naval commander in chief had before been taken prisoner in battle, conspired to bestow a peculiar brilliancy upon Rodney's victory. 4 other ships of the line were taken, and, singularly enough, upon these particular ships was found the whole train of artillery intended for the reduction of Jamaica. Such were the leading features of the Battle of the Saints, or, as it is sometimes styled, of the 12th of April, known to the French as the Battle of Dominica. Certain points which have so far been omitted for the sake of clearness, but which affect the issue, must now be given. When the day opened, the French fleet was greatly scattered and without order. De Grasse, under the influence of his fears for the "Zélé," so precipitated his movements that his line was not properly formed at the moment of engaging. The van ships had not yet come into position, and the remainder were so far from having reached their places that De Vaudreuil, commanding the rear division and last engaged, states that the line was formed under the fire of musketry. The English, on the contrary, were in good order, the only change made being to shorten the interval between ships from 2 to 1 cable's length (700 feet). The celebrated stroke of breaking through the French line was due not to previous intention, but to a shift of wind throwing their ships out of order, and so increasing the spaces between them; while the gap through which Rodney's group penetrated was widened by the Diadème on its north side being taken aback and paying round on the other tack. Sir Charles Douglas says the immediate effect, where the flag ship broke through, was the bringing together, almost if not quite in contact with each other, the 4 ships of the enemy which were nearest on the north, to the point alluded to, and coming up in succession. This unfortunate group, composing now only one large single object at which to fire, was attacked by the Duke, Namur, and Formidable, 90-gun ships all at once, receiving several broadsides from each, not a single shot missing; and great must have been the slaughter. The Duke, being next ahead of the flag ship, had followed her leader under the French lee, but as soon as her captain saw that the Formidable had traversed the enemy's order, he did the same, passing north of this confused group, and so bringing it under a fire from both sides. The log of the Magnanime, one of the group, mentions passing under the fire of 2 three-deckers, one on either side. As soon as the order was thus broken, Rodney hauled down the signal for the line, keeping flying that for close action, and at the same time ordered his van, which had now passed beyond and north of the enemy's rear, to go about and rejoin the English centre. This was greatly delayed through the injuries to spars and sails received in passing under the enemy's fire. His own flag ship and the ships with her went about. The rear, under Hood, instead of keeping north again to join the centre, stood to windward for a time, and were then becalmed at a considerable distance from the rest of the fleet. Much discussion took place at a later day as to the wisdom of Rodney's action in breaking through his enemy's order, and to whom the credit, if any, should be ascribed. The latter point is of little concern, but it may be said that the son of Sir Charles Douglas, Rodney's chief of staff, brought forward an amount of positive evidence, the only kind that could be accepted to diminish the credit of the person wholly responsible for the results, which proves that the suggestion came from Douglas. and Rodney's consent was with difficulty obtained. The value of the manoeuvre itself is of more consequence than any question of personal reputation. It has been argued by some that, so far from being a meritorious act, it was unfortunate, and for Rodney's credit should rather be attributed to the force of circumstances than to choice. It had been better, these say, to have continued along under the lee of the French rear, thus inflicting upon it the fire of the whole English line, and that the latter should have tacked and doubled on the French rear. This argument conveniently forgets that tacking, or turning round in any way, after a brush of this kind, was possible to only a part of the ships engaged, and that these would have much difficulty in overtaking the enemies who had passed on, unless the latter were very seriously crippled. Therefore this suggested attack, the precise reproduction of the battle of Ushant, really reduces itself to the fleets passing on opposite tacks, each distributing its fire over the whole of the enemy's line without attempting any concentration on a part of it. It may and must be conceded at once that Rodney's change of course permitted the 11 rear ships of the French to run off to leeward, having received the fire of only part of their enemy, while the English van had undergone that of nearly the whole French fleet. These ships, however, were thus thrown entirely out of action for a measurable and important time by being driven to leeward, and would have been still more out of position to help any of their fleet, had not De Grasse himself been sent to leeward by Hood's division, cutting the line 3 ships ahead of him. The 13 leading French ships, obeying the last signal they had seen, were hugging the wind. The group of 6 with De Grasse would have done the same had they not been headed off by Hood's division. The result of Rodney's own action alone, therefore, would have been to divide the French fleet into 2 parts, separated by a space of 6 miles, and one of them hopelessly to leeward. The English, having gained the wind, would have been in position easily to contain the 11 lee ships, and to surround the 19 weather ones in overwhelming force. The actual condition, owing to the 2 breaches in the line, was slightly different, the group of 6 with De Grasse being placed between his weather and lee divisions, 2 miles from the former, 4 from the latter. It seems scarcely necessary to insist upon the tactical advantages of such a situation for the English, even disregarding the moral effect of the confusion through which the French had passed. In addition to this, a very striking lesson is deducible from the immediate effects of the English guns in passing through. Of the 5 ships taken, 3 were those under whose sterns the English divisions pierced. Instead of giving and taking, as the parallel lines ran by, on equal terms, each ship having the support of those ahead and astern, the French ships near which the penetrating columns passed received each the successive fire of all the enemy's division. Thus Hood's 13 ships filed by the 2 rear ones of the French van, the César and Hector, fairly crushing them, and under this concentration of fire; while in like manner, and with like results, Rodney's 6 passed by the Glorieux. This concentration, by defiling past the extremity of a column, corresponds quite accurately to the concentration upon the flank of a line, and has a special interest, because if successfully carried out, it would be as powerful an attack now as it ever has been. If quick to seize their advantage, the English might have fired upon the ships on both sides of the gaps through which they passed, as the Formidable actually did; but they were using the starboard broadsides, and many doubtless did not realize their opportunity until too late. The natural results of Rodney's act, therefore, were: 1. The gain of the wind, with the power of offensive action; 2. Concentration of fire upon a part of the enemy's order; and 3. The introduction into the latter of confusion and division, which might and did become very great, offering the opportunity of further tactical advantage. It is not a valid reply to say that had the French been more apt, they could have united sooner. A manoeuvre that presents a good chance of advantage does not lose its merit because it can be met by a prompt movement of the enemy, any more than a particular lunge of the sword becomes worthless because it has its appropriate parry. The chances were that by heading off the rear ships while the van stood on, the French fleet would be badly divided, and the move was none the less sagacious because the two fragments could have united sooner than they did had they been well handled. With the alternative action suggested of tacking after passing the enemy's rear, the pursuit became a stern chase in which both parties, having been equally engaged, would presumably be equally crippled. Signals of disability, in fact, were numerous in both fleets. Independently of the tactical handling of the two fleets, there were certain differences of equipment which conferred tactical advantage, and are therefore worth noting. The French appear to have had finer ships, and class for class heavier armaments. Sir Charles Douglas, an eminent officer of active and ingenious turn of mind, who paid particular attention to gunnery details, estimated that in weight of battery the 33 French were superior to the 36 English by the force of 4 84-gun ships, and that after the loss of the "Zélé," "Jason," and "Caton," there still remained an advantage equal to two 74's. The French admiral La Gravière admits the generally heavier calibre of French cannon at this era. The better construction of the French ships and their greater draught caused them to sail and beat better, and accounts in part for the success of De Grasse in gaining to windward; for in the afternoon of the 11th only 3 or 4 of the body of his fleet were visible from the masthead of the English flag ship, which had been within gunshot of them on the 9th. It was the awkwardness of the unlucky "Zélé" and of the "Magnanime" which drew down De Grasse from his position of vantage, and justified Rodney's perseverance in relying upon the chapter of accidents to effect his purpose. The greater speed of the French as a body is somewhat hard to account for, because, though undoubtedly with far better lines, the practice of coppering the bottom had not become so general in France as in England, and among the French there were several uncoppered and worm-eaten ships. The better sailing of the French was, however, remarked by the English officers, though the great gain mentioned must have been in part owing to Rodney's lying by, after the action of the 9th, to refit, due probably to the greater injury received by the small body of his vessels, which had been warmly engaged with greatly superior numbers. It was stated in narrating that action that the French kept at half cannon range. This was to neutralize a tactical advantage the English had in the large number of carronades and other guns of light weight but large calibre, which in close action told heavily, but were useless at greater distances. The second in command, De Vaudreuil, to whom was entrusted the conduct of that attack, expressly states that if he had come within reach of the carronades, his ships would have been quickly unrigged. Whatever judgment is passed upon the military policy of refusing to crush an enemy situated as the English division was, there can be no question that if the object was to prevent pursuit, the tactics of De Vaudreuil on the 9th was in all respects excellent. He inflicted the utmost injury with the least exposure of his own force. On the 12th, De Grasse, by allowing himself to be lured within reach of carronades, yielding this advantage, besides sacrificing to an impulse his whole previous strategic policy. Rapidly handled from their lightness, firing grape and shot of large diameter, these guns were peculiarly harmful in close action and useless at long range. In a later dispatch, De Vaudreuil says, "The effect of these new arms is most deadly within musket range. It is they which so badly crippled us on the 12th of April." There were other gunnery innovations, in some at least of the English ships, which, by increasing the accuracy, the rapidity, and the field of fire, greatly augmented the power of their batteries. These were the introduction of locks, by which the man who aimed also fired, and the fitting to the gun carriages of breast pieces and sweeps, so that the guns could be pointed farther ahead or astern, that is, over a larger field than had been usual. In fights between single ships, not controlled in their movements by their relations to a fleet, this improvement would at times allow the possessor to take a position whence he could train upon his enemy without the latter being able to reply, and some striking instances of such tactical advantage are given. In a fleet fight, such as is now being considered, the gain was that the guns could be brought to bear farther forward, and could follow the opponent longer as he passed astern, thus doubling or more the number of shots he might receive, and lessening for him the interval of immunity enjoyed between two successive antagonists. These matters of antiquated and now obsolete detail carry with them lessons that are never obsolete. They differ in no respect from the more modern experiences with the needle gun and the torpedo. And indeed this whole action of April 12, 1782, is fraught with sound military teaching. Perseverance in pursuit, gaining advantage of position, concentration of one's own effort, dispersal of the enemy's force, the efficient tactical bearing of small but important improvements in the materiel of war, have been dwelt on. To insist further upon the necessity of not letting slip a chance to beat the enemy in detail would be thrown away on any one not already convinced by the bearing of April 9 on April 12. The abandonment of the attack upon Jamaica after the defeat of the French fleet shows conclusively that the true way to secure ulterior objects is to defeat the force which threatens them. There remains at least one criticism, delicate in its character, but essential to draw out the full teachings of these events; that is, upon the manner in which the victory was followed up, and the consequent effects upon the war in general. The liability of sailing ships to injury in spars and sails, in other words, in that mobility which is the prime characteristic of naval strength, makes it difficult to say, after a lapse of time, what might or might not have been done. It is not only a question of actual damage received, which log books may record, but also of the means for repair, the energy and aptitude of the officers and seamen, which differ from ship to ship. As to the ability of the English fleet, however, to follow up its advantages by a more vigorous pursuit on the 12th of April, we have the authority of two most distinguished officers, Sir Samuel Hood, the second in command, and Sir Charles Douglas, the captain of the fleet, or chief of staff to the admiral. The former expressed the opinion that 20 ships might have been taken, and said so to Rodney the next day; while the chief of staff was so much mortified by the failure, and by the manner in which the admiral received his suggestions, as seriously to contemplate resigning his position. Advice and criticism are easy, nor can the full weight of a responsibility be felt except by the man on whom it is laid, but great results cannot often be reached in war without risk and effort. The accuracy of the judgment of these two officers, however, is confirmed by inference from the French reports. Rodney justifies his failure to pursue by alleging the crippled condition of many ships, and other matters incident to the conclusion of a hard-fought battle, and then goes on to suggest what might have been done that night had he pursued by the French fleet, which went off in a body of 26 ships of the line. These possibilities are rather creditable to his imagination, considering what the French fleet had done by day; but as regards the body of 26 ships, De Vaudreuil, who, after De Grasse's surrender, made the signal for the ships to rally round his flag, found only 10 with him next morning, and was not joined by any more before the 14th. During the following days 5 more joined him at intervals. With these he went to the rendezvous at Cap Français, where he found others, bringing the whole number who repaired thither to 20. The 5 remaining of those that had been in the action fled to Curaçoa, 600 miles distant, and did not rejoin until May. The body of 26 ships therefore had no existence in fact. On the contrary, the French fleet was very badly broken up, and several of its ships isolated. As regards the crippled condition, there seems no reason to think the English had suffered more, but rather less than their enemy, and a curious statement bearing upon this appears in a letter from Sir Gilbert Blane. It was with difficulty we could make the French officers believe that the returns of killed and wounded made by our ships to the admiral were true; and one of them flatly contradicted me, saying we always gave the world a false account of our loss. I then walked with him over the decks of the Formidable, and bid him remark what number of shot holes there were, and also how little her rigging had suffered, and asked if that degree of damage was likely to be connected with the loss of more than 14 men, which was our number killed, and the greatest of any in the fleet except the Royal Oak and Monarch. He owned our fire must have been much better kept up and directed than theirs. There can remain little doubt, therefore, that the advantage was not followed up with all possible vigor. Not till 5 days after the battle was Hood's division sent toward San Domingo, where they picked up in the Mona Passage the Jason and the Caton, which had separated before the battle and were on their way to Cap Français. These, and 2 small vessels with them, were the sole after fruits of the victory. Under the conditions of England's war, this cautious failure is a serious blot on Rodney's military reputation, and goes far to fix his place among successful admirals. He had saved Jamaica for the time, but he had not, having the opportunity, crushed the French fleet. He too, like De Grasse, had allowed the immediate objective to blind him to the general military situation and to the factor which controlled it. To appreciate the consequences of this neglect, and the real indecisiveness of this celebrated battle, we must go forward a year and listen to the debates in Parliament on the conditions of peace in February, 1783. The approval or censure of the terms negotiated by the existing ministry involved the discussion of many considerations; but the gist of the dispute was, whether the conditions were such as the comparative financial and military situations of the belligerents justified, or whether it would have been better for England to continue the war rather than submit to the sacrifices she had made. As regards the financial condition, despite the gloomy picture drawn by the advocates of the peace, there was probably no more doubt then than there is now about the comparative resources of the different countries. The question of military strength was really that of naval power. The ministry argued that the whole British force hardly numbered 100 sail of the line, while the navies of France and Spain amounted to 140, not to speak of that of Holland. With so glaring an inferiority, what hopes of success could we derive, either from the experience of the last campaign, or from any new distribution of our force in that which would have followed? In the West Indies we could not have had more than 46 sail to oppose to 40, which on the day that peace was signed lay in Cadiz Bay with 16,000 troops on board, ready to sail for that quarter of the world, where they would have been joined by 12 of the line from Havana and 10 from San Domingo. Might we not too reasonably apprehend that the campaign in the West Indies would have closed with the loss of Jamaica itself, the avowed object of this immense armament? These are certainly the reasonings of an avowed partisan, for which large allowances must be made. The accuracy of the statement of comparative numbers was denied by Lord Keppel, a member of the same party, but lately at the head of the Admiralty, a post which he had resigned because he disapproved the treaty. English statesmen, too, as well as English seamen, must by this time have learned to discount largely the apparent when estimating the real power of the other navies. Nevertheless, how different would have been the appreciation of the situation, both moral and material, had Rodney reaped the full fruits of the victory which he owed rather to chance than to his own merit, great as that undeniably was. A letter published in 1809, anonymous, but bearing strong internal evidence of being written by Sir Gilbert Blane, the physician of the fleet, and long on intimate terms with Rodney, who was a constant sufferer during his last cruise, states that the admiral thought little of his victory on the 12th of April, 1782. He would have preferred to rest his reputation upon his combinations against De Guichen, April 17, 1780, and looked upon that opportunity of beating, with an inferior fleet, such an officer, whom he considered the best in the French service, as one by which, but for the disobedience of his captains, he might have gained immortal renown. Few students will be inclined to question this estimate of Rodney's merit on the two occasions. Fortune, however, decreed that his glory should depend upon a battle brilliant in itself, to which his own qualities least contributed, and denied him success when he most deserved it. The chief action of his life, in which merit and success met, the destruction of Langaro's fleet off Cape St. Vincent, has almost passed into oblivion; yet it called for the highest qualities of a seaman, and is not unworthy of comparison with Hawke's pursuit of Conflans. Within the 2 years and a half which had elapsed since Rodney was appointed to his command, he had gained several important successes, and, as was remarked, had taken a French, a Spanish, and a Dutch admiral. In that time he had added 12 line of battle ships, all taken from the enemy, to the British navy, and destroyed 5 more; and to render the whole still more singularly remarkable, the Ville de Paris was said to be the only first-rate man of war that ever was taken and carried into port by any commander of any nation. Notwithstanding his services, the party spirit that was then so strong in England, penetrating even the army and navy, obtained his recall upon the fall of Lord North's ministry, and his successor, a man unknown to fame, had already sailed when news arrived of the victory. In the fallen and discouraging state of English affairs at the time, it excited the utmost exultation, and silenced the strictures which certain parts of the admiral's previous conduct had drawn forth. The people were not in a humor to be critical, and amid the exaggerated notions that prevailed of the results achieved, no one thought of the failure to obtain greater. This impression long prevailed. As late as 1830, when Rodney's Life was first published, it was asserted that the French navy had been so effectually crippled and reduced by the decisive victory of the 12th of April as to be no longer in a condition to contest with Great Britain the empire of the seas. This is nonsense, excusable in 1782, but not to the calm thought of after days. The favorable terms obtained were due to the financial embarrassment of France, not to her naval humiliation; and if there was exaggeration in the contention of the advocates of peace, that England could not save Jamaica, it is probable that she could not have recovered by arms the other islands restored to her by the treaty. The memory of De Grasse will always be associated with great services done to America. His name, rather than that of Rochambeau, represents the material succor which France gave to the struggling life of the young republic, as Lafayette's recalls the moral sympathy so opportunely extended. The incidents of his life subsequent to the great disaster which closed his active career cannot be without interest to American readers. After the surrender of the Ville de Paris, De Grasse accompanied the English fleet and its prizes to Jamaica, whither Rodney repaired to refit his ships, thus appearing as a captive upon the scene of his intended conquest. On the 19th of May he left the island, still a prisoner, for England. Both by naval officers and by the English people he was treated with that flattering and benevolent attention which comes easily from the victor to the vanquished, and of which his personal valor at least was not unworthy. It is said that he did not refuse to show himself on several occasions upon the balcony of his rooms in London, to the populace shouting for the valiant Frenchman. This undignified failure to appreciate his true position naturally excited the indignation of his countrymen, the more so as he had been unsparing and excessive in denouncing the conduct of his subordinates on the unlucky 12th of April. "He bears his misfortune," wrote Sir Gilbert Blane, "with equanimity, conscious, as he says, that he has done his duty. He attributes his misfortune not to the inferiority of his force, but to the base desertion of his officers in the other ships, to whom he made the signal to rally, and even hailed them to abide by him, but was abandoned." This was the keynote to all his utterances. Writing from the English flag ships the day after the battle, he threw upon the greater part of his captains the misfortunes of the day. Some had disobeyed his signals, others, and notably the captains of the Languedoc and Couronne, that is to say, his next ahead and astern, had abandoned him. He did not, however, confine himself to official reports, but while a prisoner in London published several pamphlets to the same effect, which he sent broadcast over Europe. The government, naturally thinking that an officer could not thus sully the honor of his corps without good reason, resolved to search out and relentlessly punish all the guilty. The captains of the Languedoc and Couronne were imprisoned as soon as they reached France, and all papers, logs, etc., bearing upon the case were gathered together. Under all the circumstances, it is not to be wondered at that on his return to France, De Grasse, to use his own words, found no one to hold out a hand to him. It was not till the beginning of 1784 that all the accused and witnesses were ready to appear before the court martial; but the result of the trial was to clear entirely, and in the most ample manner, almost every one whom he had attacked, while the faults found were considered of a character entitled to indulgence, and were awarded but slight punishment. Nevertheless, cautiously observes a French writer, one cannot but say with the court that the capture of an admiral commanding 30 ships of the line is an historical incident which causes the regret of the whole nation. As to the conduct of the battle by the admiral, the court found that the danger of the "Zélé" on the morning of the 12th was not such as to justify bearing down for so long a time as was done; that the crippled ship had a breeze which was not then shared by the English 5 miles away to the southward, and which carried her into Basse Terre at 10 A.M.; that the engagement should not have been begun before all the ships had come into line; and finally, that the fleet should have been formed on the same tack as the English, because by continuing to stand south, it entered the zone of calms and light airs at the north end of Dominica. De Grasse was much dissatisfied with the finding of the court, and was indiscreet enough to write to the minister of marine, protesting against it and demanding a new trial. The minister, acknowledging his protest, replied in the name of the king. After commenting upon the pamphlets that had been so widely issued, and the entire contradiction of their statements by the testimony before the court, he concluded with these weighty words: "The loss of the battle cannot be attributed to the fault of private officers. It results from the findings that you have allowed yourself to injure by ill-founded accusations the reputation of several officers in order to clear yourself in public opinion of an unhappy result, the excuse for which you might perhaps have found in the inferiority of your force, in the uncertain fortune of war, and in circumstances over which you had no control. His Majesty is willing to believe that you did what you could to prevent the misfortunes of the day, but he cannot be equally indulgent to your unjust imputations upon those officers of his navy who have been cleared of the charges against them. His Majesty, dissatisfied with your conduct in this respect, forbids you to present yourself before him. I transmit his orders with regret, and add my own advice to retire, under the circumstances, to your province." De Grasse died in January, 1788. His fortunate opponent, rewarded with peerage and pension, lived until 1792. Hood was also created a peer, and commanded with distinction in the early part of the wars of the French Revolution, winning the enthusiastic admiration of Nelson, who served under him; but a sharp difference with the admiralty caused him to be retired before achieving any brilliant addition to his reputation. He died in 1816 at the great age of 92. Chapter 13.